Hey, welcome back to Past Pawns. Today's video is going to be talking about how to anticipate your opponent's moves, so figuring out and predicting what your opponent is going to play in response to your move. Now, this is a concept that a lot of people struggle with, and I think it can be divided into 4 steps, and learning those 4 steps just once will help you get a lot better at recognizing what your opponent's plans are and predicting their moves. So for step 1, just acknowledge that your opponent is a human. This is not a one-person chess game, right? Somebody else is playing and they have their own plans and they're trying to attack you and win. So whenever your opponent plays something, think like, why did they play it? What is the intention behind that move? Upon doing so, you're going to quickly realize that there's going to be some sort of follow-up to their move, or there's some sort of plan or trick or something along that line. So if you realize that all of your opponent's moves aren't just random moves and they're made with a purpose, is going to make you a much better chess player, because you're going to be able to recognize your opponent's plans much quicker and much easier. So I wanted to show you guys an example where I didn't do that and I quickly got in a lot of trouble. And this is a game between one of my friends and I. And I'm just going to skip right to the point. And here he hung his rook. And this game was a disaster. We both hung a bunch of pieces. But here he played queen c7, and I didn't question why he played queen c7. I had no thought at all about that. And what ended up happening is I just developed my pieces in a very lazy manner. He brought his knight out, and suddenly my queen was trapped. And so in this position, thankfully, I was still up a little bit of material because I was able to get 2 rooks for a queen. But this could have all been avoided if I just thought for a second, hey, what does queen c7 do? You know, because it's not the most active developing move. And it kind of shows like queen c7 covers out a bunch of the squares for the queen's escape. And then the second part was knight c6, which blocks my queen's escape route, right? So the purpose of queen c7 was to support the c6 square, so this c6 knight was not hanging when he played knight c6. And so by spending a little bit of time thinking about what does my opponent want in this position, like why did he play queen c7, you're going to be able to avoid a lot of blunders, and B, you're going to be able to recognize the attacks that your opponent is planning much quicker. Now, the second step is figuring out your opponent's ideal position and then being able to predict your opponent's moves based off of that. So here's another example with a game from one of my friends. And once we got into this position, he played queen g5. And I realized that in his ideal position, he would play knight f4, and I would not be able to capture the pawn because my king would be pinned, right? So I realized that I had to either move my king or knight e2. And why did I realize that? Well, because after queen g5, what is the purpose of queen g5, right? You got to think about that. Well, in an ideal world, he would want to play f4 instead of the knight. But unfortunately, his king is pinned. So knight f4 makes the most sense, right? Since I cannot capture it. And it would be attacking my bishop, which would have no good retreat squares. And so based off of that, I was able to identify that in his ideal position, he would want to play knight f4. He would want to get rid of the spin, so he'd want to move his king back and start pushing these pawns. So I realized that I had to act quickly if I wanted to gain a significant attack. And so this was the main difference between choosing the move king h1 or the move that I played, which was knight e2. Now, king h1 isn't a terrible move, but it gives black a decent advantage because it's very passive and very slow. What knight e2 does that king h1 doesn't is knight e2 brings another piece over to the king side and helps form an attack, which is necessary considering that black was just a few moves away from centralizing and being completely fine in this position. So I played knight e2, he played knight f4 as expected, we traded, and the rest of the game just showcased the attack. And here I wanted to point out another thing, is that I captured with my f-pawn. Generally speaking, in positions where your g-pawn gets captured and you have the choice between h and f and your king is castled, you want to capture with your h-pawn, and the purpose of capturing with your h-pawn is that your king is a little bit safer, right? So when you capture with your f-pawn, your king is exposed, it's easier to attack. But on the contrary, it opens up this rook and allows me to continue my attack. And also I realized that after capturing this pawn, I would receive a check. And a way to anticipate your opponent's moves is to check some forced lines. So after, for example, bishop d4 check, if I slid to king h1, I realized that my opponent didn't have a single check, and that was enough for me to play, f takes, because there was no solid way for my opponent to continue his own attack. So this is what happened, and ended up winning this pawn. And just a few moves later, we were up a rook and looking good. Now, the third and final step is just figuring out the plans of your opponent based on their opening. So a lot of people study their openings and they only focus on the things that they have to do, but you should also figure out the plans of your opponent. So for example, in the King's Indian, right, the G7 bishop is very strong, and black tries to create pawn breaks all over the place. So with C6 and moves like F6, because it ruins white's pawn structure, right? And so you just need to understand the basic guidelines and ideas that arise from different openings and the plans that your opponent tries to execute, because that'll make it a lot easier in understanding what your opponent plans on playing. That pretty much brings me to the end of this video. Now, I hope this was instructive and I hope you guys enjoyed. I thank you all for watching, and goodbye.